exercise complete now. We're back in the carriage returning to station.
You blind lifeboat, that's all received. Thanks for that.
Atlantic conveyor, Atlantic conveyor, Atlantic conveyor. This is Linus Pilots calling Atlantic conveyor, channel 9. Do you receive me, over?
Liverpool Pilot, Atlantic conveyor, channel 9, listening.
Atlantic conveyor, Liverpool Pilot. Yes, good afternoon, sir. ETA, please, full point Linus.
ETA point Linus, 1 hour from now, over.
1 hour from now, thanks very much indeed, sir. Pilot will board on arrival. If you'd have your pilot ladder ready on the port side, please, sir. 1 metre above the water. The pilot will come from Amloch today.
It's well understood. Pilot ladder on the port side, 1 metre from the water, and the pilot boat is coming out from Amloch. Very well, over and out.
Yes, thank you, Atlantic conveyor. We're listening channel 9 all the time.
Standing by 9 and 60.
Another Atlantic crossing is safely completed by one of today's giants of the sea, ACL's 51,725 gross-ton container vessel, the Atlantic Conveyor. This state-of-the-art vessel is one of only 6 unique roll-on roll-off ships, each capable of carrying as many as 2,911 containers, plus a considerable amount of ro-ro cargo. With a length of 292 metres, she comes close to rivaling great liners like the QE2 in size. Launched in 1984 at Swan & Hunters in Newcastle, Atlantic Conveyor is powered by Kincaid engines producing 23,750 shp and giving her an all-weather service speed of 17.5 knots. Enabling her and her sisters to maintain a tight and reliable schedule across the ever-competitive Atlantic sea routes. Today, as this huge vessel is skillfully manoeuvred into Liverpool's Langton Lock and the Seaforth container terminal, it's difficult to imagine that this used to be one of the busiest major sea estuaries in the world. It serviced not only the cities of Liverpool and Manchester, but also the many smaller ports that once lined the banks of the River Mersey, reaching right into the middle of the country's industrial heartland. Ships were so much smaller then, the biggest being no more than a quarter of the size of Atlantic Conveyor, and their crews would have been stretched to the limit of all their nautical skills to navigate a safe passage. They had to weave through the myriad of assorted merchant ships that slipped endlessly in and out of the 50-odd docks that once made this place one of the busiest and most vibrant ports the world has ever known. Once again in this great liner series, with the help of some very rare archive film, we're going to sail back in time to that incredible boom period of long-distance cruising. The days which began with the spectacle of thousands of workers hurrying their way to the docks by bus, ferry and the overhead railway to tend their ships. They were all servants of the many shipping companies that were legends in their time. Cunard, Canadian Pacific, White Star Line, Harrison's, Bibby Lines, Blue Funnel, Furnace Withy, Elder Dempster, Palm Line, Tate and Lyle, Ellerman. There were many, many others, including quite small family concerns, in the days when ship-owning was a much more individual venture. Every available berth was in use by the staggering star-cast list of ships that once strutted this unique stage, laying on one of the greatest maritime shows on Earth. The curtain rose each morning with the waiting audience ever ready to receive another great maritime celebrity. a White Star liner safely arrives back after a voyage from North America to be greeted by eager crowds in a frenzy of celebration. But not all the ships in those days of the great sailing adventure were quite so fortunate. Here in New York in 1915, unsuspecting passengers full of excitement arrived at the Cunard Steamship Company's dock to board the ill-fated Lusitania. Unknowingly, the mighty Lusitania was taking her final bow from New York, her passengers adding their cheers to the farewell chorus. A famous author, Elbert Hoddard, waved to the camera. The Lusitania's direct-drive steam turbines could give her speeds in excess of 26 knots. But in these times of World War I economy, 6 of her boilers were closed down, and her speed was trimmed to 21 knots. In the early afternoon of May the 7th, just 4 days after sailing from New York, the Lusitania, shrouded in thick fog, had reduced her speed to just 15 knots. But she had reached the south coast of Ireland and was still on schedule to catch the high tide at the Liverpool bar. Suddenly she was attacked by a German U-boat. The U-20, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Walter Schweiger, fired a torpedo from 700 yards. It was impossible to miss such a large target at such close range. Within 20 minutes, the Lusitania was on the bottom, with a loss of 1,198 people, many of them sons and daughters of the Mersey. Ironically, even as the Lusitania had left New York, there had been the sinister outline of the German superliner Vaterland in the background, sitting in silence, almost as if she knew about the disaster that had lain in wait. Of course, the seafaring people of the Mersey were no strangers to tragedy and misfortune. Wars and economic depression would repeatedly dog their lives, but work just had to go on. It wasn't long after the Lusitania's loss before the building stocks at Birkenhead's Camel-Laird shipyards were full of new ships, taking shape ready to serve a new age of post-war peace and prosperity. Many of these ships would become the stars on another great maritime stage. Cunard's 19,602 gross ton Samaria, arriving from New York with over 2,000 passengers aboard. Closely followed by Lamport & Holt's 13,248 gross ton Voltaire. During the Great Depression, the Voltaire and her sister ship, the Van Dyck, were taken off the company's once profitable New York River Plate service and laid up. But in 1932, the Voltaire was refurbished, painted white, and made some cruises from Liverpool. She was so successful that she was soon joined by the Van Dyck, travelling down the west coast of Africa and other popular stretches. Together they offered passengers cruises for as little as £1 a day, that's roughly £30 in today's money. Another popular ship was Pacific Steam Navigation's Reina del Pacifico, seen here leaving for South America, built by Harland and Wolff at the Govan Yards in 1930. Another famous ship offering those £1 a day cruises was Cunard's Lancastria, waiting to berth as the Voltaire departs. Bibby Line's cargo liner Cheshire joins the cast, arriving in the Mersey after a long voyage from Rangoon. A Blue Funnel cargo liner arrives from Australia. And so it continued. To the people who lived and worked along the river's banks, it was a never-ending performance. The wise old liverbird watched as ships kept coming and going and as people sailed off to fulfill their wildest dreams. Dreams were occasionally shattered. In October 1933, Harrison Line's 5,421 gross ton Architect II was grounded during a falling tide on Pluckington Bank and broke her back. Here, however, is a trouble-free sailing. Anchor Line's 16,792 gross ton California, ready to leave for New York with 1,760 passengers safely aboard. A modest tramp steamer plays her part. And just when you thought nothing could add to this maritime spectacle, a veteran star comes on stage to make her final curtain call. The 23,884 gross ton White Star liner, the Baltic. Launched in 1903 at Harland and Wolff's Belfast shipyards, her quadruple expansion steam engines propelled her twin screws to a healthy 17 knots. She carried over 3,000 passengers. But sadly, this was to be the last time she'd be seen in the Mersey before going to breakers in Japan. A Harrison ship passes the Anchor Donaldson liner Athenia, which has just arrived from Montreal with over 1,500 passengers aboard. She weighed in at 13,470 gross tons. Sadly, she was to be the first merchant ship to be sunk in World War II when she was torpedoed on September the 3rd, 1939, with a loss of 93 people, including some of the Mersey's child evacuees. Sacks of coal were still stacked up on the quayside, waiting to fuel those older ships that were still coal burners. Another famous Cunarder, the 19,730 gross ton Scythia, built by Vickers of Barrow, she was launched in 1920 for the company's Liverpool to New York run, carrying over 2,000 passengers. She gave her owners remarkable service right up until 1958. Those glorious days of shipping seem very romantic today, but those decades ago it was almost overkill. There were almost as many ships plying the Mersey as there were buses on the streets of Liverpool. And just like buses, they often came along 3 at a time. Cunard's Lancastria, returning to Liverpool on a cold, grey October morning from a warm and sunny Mediterranean cruise. And there was the usual horde of new passengers waiting to join her for her next adventurous voyage into the sun. A little further along the quay, the White Star liner Britannic, also on a fast turnaround between cruises. What was it like to have been a passenger in those far-off days? Although British-flagged merchant ships dominated the seas, there was some stiff competition from other maritime nations, especially the Italians. Under Mussolini, they set out to build a merchant fleet to rival all comers. Here on board the Italian liner Conte Verdi, in heavy weather, we're about to pass her sister, the Conte Rosso. These ships quickly established a reputation for passing closer to each other than any other shipping company, and for them, no amount of stormy weather was going to spoil their fun. These were the days when not only did Britain have the largest merchant fleet in the world, we also helped to build almost everybody else's. For example, the 18,765 gross ton Conte Verdi was constructed by William Beardmore and Company at Glasgow in 1923 for Lloyd Sabaudo's Italy to South America service. But in 1932, for political reasons, she was transferred to the National Italian line and reassigned to the Italy Far East service. These ships were extremely popular. They had wide-open decks, service was excellent, and Conte Verdi's twin-screw steam turbines could move her 2,400 passengers smoothly through at a comfortable service speed of 18.5 knots. This gave the Conte Verdi the edge over most of the British competition on the same routes, something the Italians were always only too ready to exploit. The approach to the Suez Canal was sure to lead to the sighting of many other great and famous ships. This is Union Castle's 1929-built Llangibi Castle on one of her round Africa voyages. But all our researchers have failed to name this beautiful liner. Another Italian liner, the 13,062 gross ton MV Victoria, shows off her extremely elegant lines as she slips serenely past on her way back from the Far East, with 566 very pampered passengers aboard. Not only did she have stunning looks to woo the passengers, her quadruple screws, powered by Sulzer diesels, enabled her to boast of being the fastest motor vessel in the world at the time, reaching a top speed of 23.26 knots on her trials. A Royal Naval Hawkins-class cruiser lies quietly but deceptively alert as the Conte Verdi enters the canal. The cargo liner SS Burma steams past on her way back from Rangoon. Conte Verdi ties up at the quayside to give some of her passengers the opportunity to explore. Meanwhile, it was time for some of her other passengers to board the plane for an exciting, if rather rugged, flight back to England. An old friend from Liverpool, Cunard's Lancastria, is close by in port on one of her popular Mediterranean cruises. The Lancastria was originally built for the Anchor Line in 1920 by William Beardmore of Glasgow as the Tyrrhenia for their Glasgow-Montreal service, but she was taken over by Cunard and renamed as the Lancastria in 1924. Whilst not so elegant as the new breed of Italian liners and a little slower, managing only a stately 17 knots, Lancastria's Mediterranean cruises from Liverpool were extremely popular, and her 1,580 passengers had a very good deal. Game playing was unsophisticated but an essential part of life aboard. And the ship had its specially constructed pool, which was the social focus for the fit, the fairly fit, and others just wanting a wallow. Keep fit classes were already an obligatory part of the day for many, but they were very laid back, a far, far cry from the ruthless, efficient gymnasiums aboard the super cruise liners of today. These were the days when the word stress had yet to find its way into everyday conversation. Life was uncomplicated, passengers made a lot of their own entertainment, and many a new and lasting friendship was struck up in the process. As the sea begins to lose its rich Mediterranean blue hues, Lancastria turns home for Liverpool, and for her happy passengers, the end of another effortless, dreamy cruise is almost in sight. Sadly, Lancastria was due to meet her end in one of the most tragic sinkings in World War II. She was attacked by German planes off the western coast of France in June 1940. Struck by 4 direct hits from heavy bombs, she sank with a loss of over 3,000 lives. Among the 2,500 who were rescued, many were severely injured. The cruel statistic was that Lancastria's sinking resulted in losses which were 3 times those of the Titanic. Now some more very rare film. Here's the 26,943 gross ton White Star liner Britannic in the warm blue waters of the Caribbean. Built by Harland and Wolff at their Belfast yards in 1930 for their transatlantic service, she became very popular, especially on her West Indian and Mediterranean cruises. Her Burmeister and Wayne diesels and twin screws gave her a service speed of 18 knots, and she could carry over 1,500 passengers. In those days, the old-style leaded windows actually opened, allowing the ship to cool naturally in the fresh sea breezes. No gleaming tiled swimming pools sunk into every sun deck in those days, just another temporary timber-framed affair lined with canvas. One of the first ports of call for Britannic on this route was the then still totally unspoiled tropical paradise of Jamaica. Already at her berth in Kingston was another well-known liner from Liverpool, Canadian Pacific's Duchess of Richmond, later to be renamed Empress of Canada. How far they'd sailed from Liverpool, and what a lush, fragrant and incredible contrast this all was from the cold, misty grey of the Mersey. Next port of call, Havana, and the Duchess of Richmond, once again ahead of them, was already tucked in at her berth. All these ships helped to spread the famous reputation of the port of Liverpool and the Mersey around the world. And the two most famous liners of all time, the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, displayed with pride the name of Liverpool as their port of registration. Still more new and exciting ships were being built, like the very impressive Mauretania, constructed for Cunard by Camel Laird. Another favourite name on the move, Lamport and Holt's 13,233 gross ton liner Van Dyck casts off on a cruise to the west coast of Africa. She salutes the arrival of this great new Cunarder as the Mauretania is making the finishing touches ready for her own departure and the all-important maiden voyage to New York. This very rare archive film captures one of the greatest moments in maritime history. At 35,738 gross tons, at that time the Mauretania was the largest ship ever to have been built in an English shipyard. Her launch on the 24th of July 1938 was the greatest day in the history of both Camel Laird and the Mersey. It's been estimated that some 300,000 people lined both banks of the river for hours, waiting for her to be launched. In Liverpool, there was an unbroken line of spectators that stretched for over 6 miles. The roofs of Liverpool's highest buildings were crammed full of people, and on the river itself, everything that could possibly float was packed with sightseers. As the Mersey's new superstar, the Mauretania had to live up to her leading role. Both she and her busy attendant tugs were suitably dressed for the part. The sun fought its way through the misty Mersey morning to glint on the colours of the two great Cunard funnels that loomed proudly over the spellbound spectators massed along the Liverpool skyline. The spectacle of adventurous passengers and the lavish consumer cargoes piled up on the quays of the ports was quickly replaced by a much more sombre combination of human and military cargo. The liners were duly conscripted. Military vehicles and troops lined the quaysides, and the people of the Mersey gathered nervously to take up their roles again in supporting war at sea. As the German forces occupied more and more of Europe, Britain was left to stand alone. Already, British shipping was being heavily attacked to try to stop vital supplies from getting through. The Duchess of Richmond was one of the first of many ships to carry evacuees to comparative safety. At this early stage, lifeboat drill was still looked on as being an unnecessary nuisance. As she made her way at top speed to try and outrun the U-boats, the Duchess of Richmond's 1,570 passengers tried their best to forget the war. Built by John Brown and Company on Clydebank in 1928, she used every ounce of power her steam turbines could produce to get her to Canada, dodging icebergs and U-boats, at times reaching speeds of 20 knots, until she reached sanctuary in Newfoundland. On arrival, it was essential that no time was lost in turning the ship round, ready for her voyage back to Liverpool. This is a very, very rare sight of the 42,348 gross ton Empress of Britain being painted in her wartime grey uniform in Montreal before joining a convoy for Liverpool. One by one, most of the nation's ships were being acquired for wartime service. Great ships like P&O's 19,648 gross ton Viceroy of India. She was taken off her routes cruising and sailing to Australia. The pride of the Orient Line, the 23,371 gross ton Orion, was conscripted. And Orion's rivals, P&O Strathboats like the 22,428 gross ton Strathmore, also joined the war effort. Furness with his luxury liner, the 22,575 gross ton Queen of Bermuda left its very lucrative millionaire's New York to Bermuda run to sail for Liverpool, where she would play her part in the dangerous wartime convoys. Back in Canada, in top secrecy, the Duchess of Richmond was made ready to sail, with orders to join up with a large convoy of other passenger liners en route to the Mersey and other UK ports. Losses at sea were now becoming so horribly common that the once-to-be-avoided lifeboat drill now took on a much more serious and meaningful role. At a location just east of Newfoundland, the Duchess of Richmond secretly rendezvoused with this ill-assorted convoy made up of some of the world's most famous liners, all running at speed towards the relative safety of the Mersey. Here is the 28,124 gross ton French liner, the Champlain, one of the many liners to be seen in another convoy, all constantly prey to trigger-happy German U-boat commanders. Everything possible was done to avoid alerting the U-boats. Silent running and communication by semaphore were absolute musts to help keep this highly prized convoy safe from disastrous attack. And relentlessly and vigilantly, day and night, the escorting Royal Navy A-type destroyer Amazon moved among her very valuable and vital civilian sisters. This brave naval protection of those liners was something that would never be forgotten by the men of the Merchant Navy and the people of the Mersey. Back in Liverpool, more and more young men were needed to replace the ever-increasing war losses inflicted on the Merchant Navy. To join a ship in peacetime at such a young age was a daunting enough experience, but to do that when you knew that your ship might be blown to pieces at any moment must have required enormous courage. With the relentless German attacks on these convoys, many young men never returned to their families, often being killed within their first few days at sea. But there were some U-boat commanders who, despite their grisly successes, did what they could to minimize the loss of those young lives by taking the survivors. On February the 6th, 1941, the people of the Mersey's worst fears were realized as Hitler ordered the German Luftwaffe to concentrate their attacks on the UK's ports to reinforce their U-boat blockade. In May, many of those attacks were concentrated on Liverpool and the ports of the Mersey. There were 231 sea-going merchant ships in the port of Liverpool alone at the time, many of them berthed 2 or more abreast at the quays. Add to this 48 tugs, 292 barges, plus the Royal Navy's destroyers and corvettes. There were the warehouses crammed with vital supplies such as oils, rubber, food, flax, sugar, cotton and high explosives. This huge area was a very vulnerable and a critical target. On the night of Saturday the 3rd of May, Liverpool and the Mersey ports suffered their heaviest air attack of the war when 298 German bombers dropped 363 tons of high explosive and 50,000 incendiary bombs over the area. The results were devastating. When a war finally ends, the extent of the tremendous sacrifice is counted. The British Merchant Navy lost a total of 5,550 ships during the war. Over 30,000 merchant seamen lost their lives. Just in the area of Liverpool, over 4,000 people were killed by enemy bombs. Those years of war left huge emotional scars along the Mersey, and like the physical scars left by the bombing, they'd take decades to heal. In the early days of this new peace, there was an eerie silence in the dimly lit dockyards. A cold, misty curtain hung over the ships that were to act out the next part of the Mersey's maritime saga. Now they could feel safe again, sailing through the dark. The many Mersey tugs fussed caringly around them, guiding their huge charges safely into their berths. With the quayside lamps barely cutting through the damp morning fog, the scene was set, ready for the curtain to rise on yet another act. For the first time in over 5 years, the whaling siren sounded to summon the dockers of the Mersey to work once more in peace. Here in Port Sunlight, dockers from Birkenhead and Liverpool get ready to meet ships coming in again from all over the world. One of the ships coming in is the 6,246 gross ton SS Matadi Palm on a voyage from Freetown in West Africa with a cargo of palm oil and bagged kernels. As Matadi Palm takes the long, slow turn into the Mersey from Queen's Channel, she calls for berthing instructions.
Matadi Palm to Bromborough. Are you receiving me? Over.
Bromborough answering the Matadi Palm. Yes, you're coming in loud and clear. Over to you.
Matadi Palm to Bromborough. I'm now passing Rock Light. Visibility not too good.
We're all ready for you, so keep coming along. And you're going to berth the west end of the South Quay, bow west. Is that understood?
Message received and understood. Over and out.
Righto, Dockmaster. Thank you. Goodbye. Matadi Palm is up in this tide. It's carrying 6,500 tons of bulk palm oil, 2,000 tons of bagged palm kernels, and 100 tons of beniseed.
How many gangs are going to work?
4 gangs. Fix it up as soon as possible.
Right on.
Mr. Blair, please.
The rock light comes up on the starboard side. Then to port, the crew are able to peer through the morning mist for their first sight of the towering skyline of Liverpool. Then comes the elation that everyone always experienced on arriving home after a long voyage, moving into the channels. While crews had their sagas at sea, there are many other stories from the boardrooms of those great shipping lines. William Lever was a Bolton grocer, but by 1910 he'd become the most important figure in the British soap industry. He first became involved with shipping in 1916, when he founded the Bromport Steamship Company Limited. But in the middle of World War I, it wasn't a very good time to create a new shipping line. In 2 years, the Bromport line lost half its ships to German U-boats, and in 1923 the 4 remaining ships were sold to Royal Mail. There were many mergers and some breakaways over the years. Palm Line came into being in 1949 out of the United Africa Company, and changes brought about by the Second World War. Shipping on African routes had for some years been mostly governed by the West Africa Company, which involved Elder Dempster and Alfred Holt, among others. Unilever wanted to operate ships independently, not only to carry their own cargoes, but also to act as common carriers along the African coasts. These ships brought in over 500,000 tons of palm kernels to Bromborough in a single year. Even larger cargoes were assembled here in Trinidad, strings of barges carrying huge tonnages of sugar for shipping to Liverpool. This is Tate & Lyle's sugar producer. She had a dedicated role shipping the company's single raw material from the West Indies. The 13,894 gross ton ship was built at Lithgow's Limited of Glasgow and had a service speed of 15.5 knots. Tate & Lyle's operation was extremely efficient. They had their own plantations, their own ships, refineries and distribution. They took their process right through from cutting the raw sugar cane to delivering the refined end product to the shop counter. They had total control of their market. For the crews of their ships, it was a pleasant life, reasonably short voyages, good conditions and endless days enjoying the warm blue seas of the Caribbean. Two weeks later, in the murky grey dawn of a Mersey winter morning, sugar producer delivers her cargo of raw sugar at Liverpool's Huskisson dock, ready to be taken to Tate & Lyle's Liverpool refinery at the wonderfully named Love Lane.